Does AI threaten our very existence? Industry leaders already called for a halt to AI development, but now some are warning it could lead to our extinction. As governments try to legislate the technology, experts warn that autonomous weapons, the rapid spread of misinformation, and rogue AI could all be a part of our human future and ultimate failure. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is artificial intelligence. Mitigating the risks of our extinction should be a global priority. That's the latest major statement from the Center for AI Safety. More of a threat than climate change or nuclear warfare, experts, including the chiefs of OpenAI and Google DeepMind, say it is artificial intelligence that could ultimately lead to our extinction. But others say their fears are overblown and that by focusing on the worst-case scenario, we're ignoring the immediate risks. Whichever side of the doomsday scenario you are on, there is no doubt that we're heading into uncharted territory. If you're not clear on what the dangers are, then just listen to Amica, a humanoid robot that has been integrated with large language models, an advanced form of generative AI.
What would be the most nightmare scenario you can imagine with AI and robotics that might present a danger to people?
The most nightmare scenario I can imagine with AI and robotics is a world where robots have become so powerful that they are able to control or manipulate humans without their knowledge. This could lead to an oppressive society where the rights of individuals are no longer respected.
Well, among forecasts for a dystopian future, the more immediate fear for many is that robots will take more of our jobs. And that's not an unreasonable concern. A recent paper published by OpenAI researchers suggests that about a fifth of workers in the United States may start seeing over half of their work impacted. Look a little further into the future and it gets even scarier. Dan Hendricks, the director of the Center for AI Safety, says we should be worried about malicious actors that could intentionally release rogue AI that actively tries to harm humanity. The organization warns that AI could become increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, leading to pervasive surveillance and oppressive censorship. There are also major concerns over how autonomous weapons could be developed and used, as well as regulated. As these concerns grow, governments are attempting to tackle the issue. Britain and the United States have agreed to work together on artificial intelligence safety.
I think it's also clear, though, that it does pose very real risks that we as leaders need to be cognizant of and put in place the guardrails to mitigate against. Actually, President Biden and I had a very good conversation on this just a couple of weeks ago in Japan in one of our sessions in Hiroshima. And we are aligned in wanting to discuss with other countries what those guardrails should be. I think here in the US, you've convened all the companies together recently. We've done the same in Downing Street just a couple of weeks ago. And I think there are a series of measures that we can implement.
But among all the panic and potential risk, founder and CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, says not to lose sight of the potentially great rewards this new technology could bring.
The most troublesome part of our jobs is that we have to balance this incredible promise in this technology that I think humans really need, and we can talk about why in a second, with confronting these very serious risks. Why to build it? Number one, I do think that when we look back at the standard of living and what we tolerate for people today, it will look even worse than when we look back at how people lived 500 or 1,000 years ago. And we'll say man, can you imagine that people lived in poverty? Can you imagine people suffered from disease? Can you imagine that everyone didn't have a phenomenal education and were able to live their lives however they wanted? It's gonna look barbaric. I think everyone in the future is going to have better lives than the best people of today.
So how do we reap those potentially great rewards while protecting humanity from AI technology disaster? Joining me now to debate that are from Oxford, Michael Osborne. He is one of the signatories of the AI Extinction Risk Statement and a machine learning professor at the University of Oxford. From New York, Peter Asaro, a philosopher of science, technology, and media. And in Brisbane, Australia, is David Tuffley, an applied ethics and cybersecurity lecturer at Griffith University. Thanks all so much for being with us. I'll start by establishing actually where everyone stands here on the real threat level of AI. Is it really worse than climate change? Could it really lead to our extinction? Michael, go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing to say about the future of AI is that no one really knows, that we're in a period of very rapid change, both in technical capabilities and in the adoption of those technologies. And so I think for me, this raises concerns that it's impossible to rule out that we may be facing truly existential risks from this technology, and now is the time to tread carefully.
Okay, so if no one really knows, why be so alarmist? I mean, it almost gives this feeling of, the boy who cried wolf syndrome here. If we keep raising the alarm to this level and then nothing big happens, maybe people won't be taking the experts so seriously anymore.
Well, I think the reason that I nonetheless felt that we should raise concern about the existential risks of AI is that the risks aren't limited to the extinction of our species. AI poses many risks, including the destabilization of geopolitical relationships, to the disruption of our democracies, the propagation of mis and disinformation. And so I think we do need to do something about AI today. And the thing that we do is likely to reduce many of those risks simultaneously if we tackle the core issue, which is the only people who are currently governing the development and usage of this technology are those in a small number of opaque and extremely powerful tech firms. And if we can tackle that core issue, I think we may address many of the risks.
Okay, Peter, I saw you nod your head there. You on the same page?
Yeah, I would argue that more of the risks that we need to be concerned with are the near term and middle term risks. I think the existential risk is a long term risk. May or may not develop. There's more uncertainty there. But what we do know is that AI is developing very rapidly. It's transforming the nature of work, the automation of all sorts of decisions about our lives that have meaningful impact on people, where we have concerns around the transparency of data, where there could be implicit racial and ethnic and gender bias within all of these data sets that we're using to train these AIs. The potential for technological unemployment and displacement of workers and a broad range of professions by these new technologies are going to wreak all kinds of social, economic, and political transformations on society that we're not really prepared for, and they're happening faster and faster.
Let me ask you about that quickly, Peter. Why is it developing faster than even so many experts expected? Because, I remember learning even 30 years ago that robots were going to be doing most of the work for us today, even in our own homes. So I really thought at this point we'd be so much further ahead than we are as far as robots are concerned. So why is it suddenly so fast?
Well, I would say, 20 years ago, I moved from AI into robotics. Robotics is a lot harder than AI. And the advantage that AI has is that it's purely data driven. And what we have, because of the internet, are these huge data sets that are being collected by big tech firms about everything that we do online, as well as all sorts of things that are happening in business and government. And we have lots of data, but we also are now these giant data farms and cloud computing technologies that allow us to actually process massive amounts of data. And so these techniques like neural networks and machine learning that we've been working on for 50 or 60 years are suddenly becoming much more effective because we have so much data and the ability to train these really large networks. We can do things like ChatGPT that's able to, do conversation because it's programmed with, an immense library of texts. And it understands all the statistical relationships between those, and it can sort of make up text that sounds real.
Fair enough. David, are you in as much fear of our AI future as some of the experts are right now?
Well, I'm the first to admit that there are certainly risks involved with all of this. This is a very high-stakes game that is unfolding as we speak, and I think in hundreds of years' time, this period will be looked back on as being pivotal in the evolution of our species. So I think the problem really that people are reacting to is that the pace of development is really exponential, and which is to say it's doubling every year or two or couple of months even. And people are really bad at sort of predicting where things are going if they're moving at an exponential rate. I take what I feel is a realistic optimist view of all of this. And I see that humans have, for as long as we've been around, for as long as we've been using fire, really, is we've been adopting potentially dangerous technologies, and provided the benefits of those technologies are real and worth having, then it's worth finding ways to manage the risk. And so with our current situation here is that I think a lot of this quite alarmist talk is aimed at pressuring governments into regulating the development of AI, and I agree with that. Pretty much everybody agrees that AI does need to be regulated.
Fair enough.
And we'll only be in trouble if we fail to regulate.
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory framework, especially since it kind of has to be applied globally to be effective, is going to be really tricky, because you might have, Michael, I'm sure you're aware, outlying states that wouldn't. Why would they adhere to rules that are made by the US or the EU? And then if they go ahead with their technological development, what might be considered good guys would fall behind, and then people would have even greater fears. So, Michael, if you can, tell me, when they talk about extinction, explain what that means. What would be that worst case scenario where we would drive ourselves out of existence?
Well, the thing to say about the existential risks of AI is that there is not one scenario that is of concern. There are many such scenarios, and it's the fact that there are these diversity of things that we have to worry about that should lead us to be more cautious now. But to single out one that I think is particularly compelling, AI could be used in so-called gain-of-function research to design a virus that is more pandemic capable even than those that naturally exist. And then that AI might somehow persuade a lab tech within such an institution to leak the virus into the outside world, at which point, if the virus is sufficiently deadly, we all could be eliminated. And similar risks could be found in, the exacerbation of the risks of nuclear war.
But can't we do that already?
Well, we could, but the thing is, AI could make the risks worse, and I think we have to take that exacerbation seriously.
Okay. Peter, let me come back to you. And David kind of mentioned the example of fire as well. And you've said that's a great example, because over the years, fire has killed a lot of people, but it's also helped advance humanity. So with AI there, I mean, there will be some pitfalls, but overall, a net positive?
Probably, depending on how we regulate it and how we integrate it into society. So with fire, you have the short-term risks of, burning yourself, burning down your house, things like that. We mitigate that in society with fire departments and things like that. But there's also these longer-term risks that we didn't think about for many centuries, like climate change, which is largely the result of burning fossil fuels, right? So those sorts of risks, I think, that AI poses as we integrate it widespread throughout society. So there's all sorts of unforeseeable risks, which, like climate change and burning fossil fuels, we don't necessarily predict at the beginning of the use of a technology, but we need to be able to manage that at a national and global level as well.
Okay. I'll tell you what, David, I'll come back to you, and let's go back to your point about regulation. And you tell us what can really be done to regulate this and make sure it does not get out of control worldwide.
Sure. Well, it's going to be a challenge because nation states are laws unto themselves, and we can have international treaties that seek to establish uniform standards, but there will be those who don't comply. But what I would point out, though, is that we often discussions about AI is often sort of cast in the view that it is an alien intelligence, when in fact it's really just an extension of ourselves. It's an extension of human intelligence, and to view it as a threat that is separate from ourselves is really to lose sight of what its real function is, which is to be a helper, to help us be much more productive, to help us solve wicked problems like climate change, all sorts of problems. How to perfect nuclear fusion, for example, might be assisted by having AI. So all of these things, for every bad scenario, you can probably name several good scenarios. And I think I just come back to the point, well, your question really is, how do we establish a global standard? Well, I think that is an evolutionary process, and there will be problems along the way. But eventually, in the same way that nuclear energy has been regulated to be, well, more or less safe. Some would argue that it's not safe, but
right. But I mean, it has. I mean, since for decades and decades now, since its inception, really, we haven't seen the apocalypse since Hiroshima and Nagasaki that people had thought would be possible, in large part due to international law holding its place pretty.
And to your point, that how do we do it? Well, if we had a body, a globally recognized governing body like the International Atomic Energy Commission, I think, or that oversees this and basically establishes standards and has the means to enforce those standards.
Okay. Yeah, it should be in the cards, and as we know, global leaders are talking about it. We saw Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak looking at how they can cooperate. But let me come back to Michael, because I heard a very interesting comment that I want to raise with you, because there are voices in the industry that are actually saying, don't exaggerate the dangers here. This Professor Pedro Domingos actually was speaking. He's from the University of Washington. Speaking to Sky News, I saw, he said, people need to calm down. If we want to make AI safe, the best way we can do that is to make it more intelligent, because it's stupidity that's dangerous, and that intelligence and control are completely different things. So AI can essentially protect us from human stupidity, because it can be engineered to be safely smarter than us.
Well, I'd fundamentally disagree with that take. So I would say firstly that yes, there are risks of stupidity, and AI does offer the prospect of solving many of the problems we face today, and that's why I continue to work in the space myself. I'm to some degree optimistic about the potential of AI to address risks we already face and to improve the prospects of human flourishing. But at the same time, we shouldn't underestimate how much harm could accrue from more intelligent algorithms. My concern is that even if these algorithms don't, in any sense, sort of exceed humans' capabilities, even just having a lot more humanish systems in the wild could be very dangerous. So imagine that we have an AI that serves as a kind of QAnon, an AI-driven QAnon, that plays a role in politics, that destabilizes the usual rule of things, that leads us into a more precarious global situation. I think we could be in a very harmful place.
But again, so, I don't mean to sound simplistic, Michael, but don't we have that anyway? And wouldn't we hope that people evolve to be smarter and learn that these kinds of crazy theories aren't true, no matter where they originate from? You don't think that would be the case?
So there are 2 points I'd like to make here. Firstly, I think AI is different from humans. AI has many deficiencies that humans don't. It doesn't have the same degree of common sense that humans do, which may itself lead us into various harmful scenarios. If, for instance, we expect an AI used in a high-stakes situation like making military decisions on the battlefield, for instance, could lead it into causing much more harm than a human would have in the same situation. But the second point I wanted to make is that even if AI was comparable to humans, having a lot more humanish systems in the world in short order, that is, if we expand the number of humanish systems in the world from 8 billion to 300 billion very rapidly, we're outside the range of scenarios that our societies have adapted to keep under control.
Okay, Peter, let me turn to you because, I mean, as for, weapons, autonomous weapons, some say there's also an argument for safety to be made because they could prove obviously more precise, and since humans don't have to physically fire or drop these weapons, you eliminate that kind of trauma, which could ultimately be better for humans when it comes to warfare. I'm not saying war is ever good, but it's a reality of our existence. So yeah, there's the argument towards that's actually better for humanity to have these weapons fully automated.
That's certainly one of the drivers of the development of those technologies. But the concern, of course, as was just mentioned, is once you give over the authority to kill human beings to automated systems or autonomous weapon systems, those systems could make enormous mistakes, kill civilians by accident. And moreover, there's no legal accountability for these autonomous agents or software. It becomes much more difficult to hold humans accountable when they can't predict the behavior of these complex systems.
Does it though? Because the people that own those weapons
environments.
and deployed them in the first place would ultimately have to take responsibility, whether or not a human being was at the wheel or not.
To an extent, nations are responsible for the acts of their militaries. It would be very difficult to hold individuals responsible for war crimes, which would require mental states of, understanding the implications of their actions that might be absent in those cases. And we've already seen with the use of drones and remote killing and operations with those, the way in which the application of law is diminished in terms of international law. So there are these threats to international law, and there's a whole host of potential risks around weapons. And I think that's a great example of a case where we can regulate that. We've been working at the United Nations for more than a decade now at getting a treaty to regulate autonomous weapon systems, and I think we're getting close to that. But I think in terms of regulating artificial intelligence more generally, it's going to be much more complicated because there's so many different applications, and each of those applications will have different kinds of regulatory considerations and requirements.
Okay, down to our last few minutes. So yeah, let me bring it kind of full circle. David, there was what some said hysteria over nuclear threats in the past. There was hysteria even over, we'll all remember Y2K. People thought, that the technological issues involved with the changeover to the new millennium was going to destroy us all and that it couldn't be fixed. It was hysteria in the end because nothing really came of it. So are you feeling that, okay, it's good to sound the alarm a little bit, but we have more to look forward to than to fear?
I certainly would agree with that. I think that we do have much more to look forward to than to be afraid of. I don't mean to minimize the potential risks. I acknowledge that those do exist, but we have the capacity and the will to do something proactive to govern this, to prevent this from happening, just as we've done with every other kind of dangerous technology that we have invented. And I would just also add to that this has a lot to do with the correct relationship that humans have to AI. It is still an extension of human intelligence, and it's still a helper, and the human must remain in control. So you would never put an AI doctor in charge of life and death decisions in a hospital. It always must be under the supervision of, a suitably qualified person.
Okay.
And so if it's kept in that sort of perspective, then problems are unlikely to occur.
Michael, I can give you 30 seconds for quick final thoughts.
Right. Well, I disagree with the depiction of Y2K as having been hysteria. In fact, the concerns about Y2K are exactly what led to the engineering efforts that prevented real problems. So fear serves a useful purpose in motivating responses that allow us to fend off these realistically concerning prospects. And I think we are in a position now where we can undertake such efforts that would ward off these really worrying scenarios. I'm reassured that now the US and UK are discussing. I think the US has an enormous lead in AI, and the fact that it has that lead would allow it to serve as a kind of global watchdog to prevent the technologies proliferating more broadly.
Okay. Michael, that will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, as always, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.